have any extra config, so we can just call start coin like this. What is the issue? I actually called it init coin, of course, init coin, and then we don't have any issues with that. Lastly, on iOS main, open the main view controller, and here in this compose UI view controller, we do have a function, this configure function, which also calls just once, where we can init coin. So this should be everything we need in order to be able to now inject these dependencies that we've provided in coin. We still need to adjust our setup here. So this application class should not now take an engine because it doesn't need that. We can remove this, go inside of application, remove the engine here. Then we suddenly can't construct these dependencies here anymore, which we don't need because we have these in our coin modules. So let's rather get rid of all that, because the only thing the screen, the actual UI now needs, is the instance of the view model. And the view model gets all the rest of our dependency chain. It gets the repository implementation, the data source, the HTTP client, all behind the scenes. But in our UI, we really just need the view model. And this works with val view model is equal to coin view model. This is just used to check if there is a view model implementation of our book list view model. And if so, coin will retrieve it and properly bind it and couple it to our composable screen. We can then pass this here to our book list screen root. And here, since the book list view model takes in the repository, a coin will automatically also create this chain of dependencies that the view model relies on, depends on, and inject these automatically. So this way, we should still be able to actually launch our app and use it just like before, where we had this remember block here. No, we're not, because we did not fix these remaining issues where we pass in our engine, of course. Let's remove this. Same in desktop main here. Try this again, checking this on my device. There we go, it's launching. And that looks hopefully good. I'm not sure if it crashed because it flashed a little bit. Was there a crash? No, it seems like it was successfully loaded. If we, oh, that's a very long log here. Yeah, let me just relaunch this quickly. Then we should see this once and for all. There we go. Yes. Okay, the flash was just because we have our dummy books, which we can actually remove now since we are able to load books from the API. So where did we declare these? I think in our state class. Did we? The book presentation. Book list state, yeah, let's remove these dummy books and just make it this an empty list, because if we then launch this, also in our preview, in the preview we actually do need the dummy books. Let's put these then as a private val in the preview, but not assign this to our state. So we go to our preview. We need to extend this a little bit here. In our preview, we can then put our list of dummy books, make it a private val. So we do have it for our preview, but not for our initial state. Let's open the preview again, like this. If we now relaunch this, then we should not get this flash with our dummy books, but we should immediately see the loading indicator. No, we did not, because the loading value is false by default. Let's try this once more. Yes, now we get it immediately. And then we load the books and we see everything. Very cool. So we now have our dependency injection setup in place. And when we now add more classes, more instances to our code, it's very easy to extend this by just defining the declaration here in our modules, in our shared module or platform module, depending on the dependency. The next thing that I would like to do, as I said, is setting up our navigation so that we have everything set in place in order to then get to the detailed screen. Where should navigation happen in a Compose multi-platform project? And what do we actually use for navigation? Well, I would recommend to use the official navigation library that comes from JetBrains. It's usually a good idea to stick what comes from the makers of something. Not always, but for navigation, I would say so. There are other navigation libraries that you can also use, like Voyager, Decompose, which are also quite decent. But since I'm just so used to using this navigation library from Android, I also want to use it here. And our app Composable is the perfect entry point for that. So let's go in here. And first of all, let's wrap everything with our material theme. So we also get proper theming values. And in here, we can then declare our nav controller, which is the central instance that we use to jump from one screen to another. We get that with remember nav controller. And we can then declare our nav host. So the nav host is really just the place where we say, okay, this is our nav controller. This is our start destination, our very first visible screen. And here we have all those composable screens that we want to have in our app and that we want to be able to navigate to. So here for the nav host, the nav controller is just our nav controller. We've created above. And then we want to have a start destination, which is of type any here. Because Compose navigation, Compose multi-platform navigation now also supports the type-safe approach. So that means we have really type-safe routes without having to define any string routes anymore, like a web URL. That was very error-prone, but now with type-safe navigation, this is a lot better. And I would like to define these in a separate file. Let's actually go to our Bookpedia package and create an app package. So this is just the logic that is used to really wire things together. So typically this would be navigation, this would be just initial setup of something. And this app package is allowed to access any other features and packages in our project. Here we don't have these constraints with domain data presentation, because if we think of a multi-module project on Android, then we will also have an application module, which is the entry point for our Android app, where we would define the navigation and all that stuff. But that is really something for the Essentials course. It's a 23-hour course bundle. This would be too much for a course like this. But in this app package, we can move in our app composable and then also define something like a routes class, or sealed interface rather. So we have a sealed interface for our routes, in our case, list screen, detail screen. Or we can say we have a data object for our book list, which is, let's call it route, because we always deal with a single route. And this also needs to be serializable, because Compose navigation will then figure out a way to serialize this and pass it to another screen. In this case, our book list screen does not have any screen arguments, but the second screen, our book detail screen, does have arguments, which is why it needs to be a data class. We call it book detail, because the argument we need on the book detail screen is the actual ID of the book that we clicked on. So this will also be a route. Serializable, but this way we have type-safe arguments. We can create a book detail instance, say we want to navigate to this specific book, and then the navigation will just work. I also like to bundle each feature in an app into a navigation graph. So a graph is really just a bundle of multiple screens that all belong together, where we say data object book graph, which is also a route. And these are already the routes we need in this app. So here in our nav host, we can say the start destination is our route dot book graph. Then here we want to define this book graph with a navigation function. This is how we define a navigation graph here in Compose. We have to pass the class that makes up the graph. So it would be route book graph again. A graph, since it can't consist of multiple screens, therefore also needs a start destination. So the first screen that shows up when we navigate to a graph, which in this case will be route book list. And here in this navigation graph, we can now define our actual screen destinations with these composable blocks. We also need to say this one is for the book list screen, which we can then put in there. And then we have one for the book detail screen, which we have in here. We can then easily extract the arguments that we use to navigate there from args, or this is actually just the backstack entry, but the args we can then retrieve with entry.toRoute, which will then return our route book detail. And then in our args, you can see we find this ID, so we can work with that. Something we now can already do here in our navigation graph, when we click on a book, we do get the book reference. What we certainly want to do is want to use our nav controller and now navigate to our detail screen. So we say nav controller, navigate to, navigate, and we want to get to our route book detail screen. And we now need to pass in the ID of the book we want to navigate to. And guess how we get that? Well, from this book reference, of course. So we pass in book.id. And then for now, we can really just put in a dummy box in here for the book detail screen, modifier fill max size or so. And then I actually need to import this. We might also want to center something here where we say content alignment center. And here we might have something like a hello world text. Or we say book detail screen. The ID is args.id. And if we now actually launch this again and try this out, we should be able to navigate to the detail screen. So this is really how easy we can now set up navigation with Compose multi-platform, thanks to this type safety. Before that was really a pain. We now have a book And when we click on that, we get to our detail screen. So you can see the ID is actually /works, blah, blah, blah. That's actually something we need to adjust because the actual book ID is what comes after this /works. So we do need to adjust this in our book mappers, since this /works/ID comes from the API, but we only want to have this in our project. So we want to go to our mappers, where we take the API book and map it to our domain book. So here for our ID, we don't just want to take the ID, but want to take the substring after last and pass in this /. So we will just take the string after the last slash in this long string. So if we relaunch this, then we should be able to just see the real book ID after loading some books. Click on this one here. Yes. Now that looks much better. However, one problem we have with this API is that there is no real dedicated book detail endpoint that contains all the data we need. So there is a book detail endpoint, but the only kind of extra data that it adds is the description, but it then lacks all the information about the book that we already have fetched before, like this one here. So the only real way to get this information of a book again on the book detail screen is then we would have to execute the search for that book again and then refer to the first item of that book list, which is of course everything but ideal because we're making an API call for a book that we have already fetched. Well, if you would now have a real local cache for all the books, so you have you fetch them from the API, and the moment you load them, you just insert them all in your local cache. Then you could just load a book on the detail screen by its ID from your local database. That would be super fast. And this is the typical way how this works when you have a local database and a remote API. However, we don't have that. We don't cache all of our books in our local database, but just the favorites. So we somehow need a better way, a different way to actually still get the book information that we've already loaded on our detail screen, while not having to pass such a big book such a big book instance as a navigation argument. Because generally it's really discouraged to pass big data as navigation arguments, since there are limits to how much we can actually store in a bundle. That's how it works internally on Android. So if this book gets more and more fields over time, and especially if it has lists like authors, where you don't know how big these might be, then in certain cases your app could crash because it's just too big to navigate with that object. And whenever you have such complex data that is hard to serialize, or that could just become very large when serializing it, but you still need to share that between multiple screens, then it's typically a good idea to implement a shared view model. So while our normal view models that we've declared in our app here, the book list view model, that is really just bound to the backstack entry where we're currently in. So from this book list screen, it's really just bound for the book list screen. And when this screen is cleared from our backstack, then the view model will also be cleared. But what we now need is, we need a view model that both book detail and book list are able to access. So the same instance of the view model needs to be shared between two screens. And this works when we have a navigation graph, because a navigation graph also has a backstack entry. So we can take a view model and scope it to the entry of the navigation graph instead. And the navigation graph will stay alive as long as any of these screens in the navigation graph stay alive. And that's exactly what we want. So if we now go ahead in our book feature, in our book list package, actually not book list, but just presentations, and now we have a shared view model. We can call this shared or just selected book view model. And this will be a super simple view model. It really just has the purpose of sharing data, sharing the selected book. We do declare this in here, a private val selected book, which is a mutable state flow, which is initially null. So initially we did not select a book. But if we do, it's certainly a book instance. And then the public variant of that selected book is, selected book as state flow. And then we have a function on select book, pass in the book, nullable. And here we really just update our value with book. So this is how our shared view model looks like. That's really all the code we put in this, since it really has the purpose to just share the selected book. And this is what I can highly recommend you if you really need a shared view model, which you often don't. Very often there are much better ways to share data, like passing it via navigation arguments, like reloading it then from the database, like just persistent storage in general. But in cases like these, a shared view model is very reasonable. But what many people would now do is they would create one big God view model that is shared between these two screens, which has all the logic for the book detail screen and all the logic for the book list screen. But I can only highly recommend you, if you create a shared view model, just create it for the state that needs to be shared and rather use 2 view models per screen than one that contains all the logic for all screens. So with this selected book view model, which now has to be shared, we can go back to our app composable and declare this here. And for that, I will actually create a little utility function, which you could use for any shared view model on Android or Compose multi-platform. Will be a private inline function actually, which will get a reified T of type view model. So it works for any type of view model in the end. It will extend a nav backstack entry, and we call this shared coin view model, because that's what it is. Alt-Enter to import this nav backstack entry, and in here we then pass in our nav controller reference, because that's also needed. It will then return our type T, so the view model we want to create, we want to share with that. And first of all, we now need to use the nav controller, or rather the nav backstack entry, which is the one where we call this function in. So either the nav backstack entry of our book list screen or the book detail screen. We now need to use this nav backstack entry to fetch or to retrieve the parent backstack entry. So that will be the entry from the book graph. Since this is the backstack entry, we want to scope the view model to. So here we can say val nav graph route to first of all fetch the route of the parent nav graph. And that's equal to destination, so the current destination, book list or book detail, dot parent, which is a nav graph, dot route. And if that doesn't exist, we can just return a coin view model here of type T. We also need to make this a composable here, by the way, composable function. Then we get rid of these issues. And now with this nav graph route, we can get access to the parent entry, so to the actual backstack entry of our parent navigation graph. We can say remember, where we pass in this as the key, so the nav backstack entry. So whenever that changes, this will re-execute. And here we say nav controller dot get backstack entry, and we pass in the nav graph route. So we now have the backstack entry of our navigation graph in this parent entry. And we can then return a coin view model where we say, okay, the view model store owner is now the parent entry. So we explicitly scope this view model to our parent nav graph rather than to this navback's entry that would just scope to a single screen. And this function really works for any type of navigation graph and any screen feature structure that you have now. So you can really just copy paste that in your project and it will work. But what we can now do is in here, book list, we can say val selected book view model is equal to it, so the backstack entry, that shared coin view model. The specific view model that we want to share here is the selected book view model. And here we pass in the nav controller. Let's also move this somewhere down here. It's a bit unlucky. Like this, I think it's a bit better. And if we now have the exact same line down here in our book list, book detail screen, here it's actually called entry. Let's remove this. We can also remove the arcs. I don't think we need these here. If we now call this here, this view model instance will be the same as this view model instance. So this one is now shared, while this one will only live as long as the book list screen is on the backstack. And what this now allows us to do is that we get the full book information we clicked on here in our detail screen. So what we can do is, instead of just displaying the ID, for example, we can also say we display the whole book. So actually have our state here, val selected book by selected book view model, selected book, collect as state with lifecycle. So we just collect that state flow as a compose state, and we then simply print this book here. If we then click on a book, we not just want to navigate, but we also want to update the currently selected book in the shared view model. So we say selected book view model on select book, and we pass in the book. And if we get back to this book list screen, then we want to reset the selected book again. And this works with a launched effect block with the key true, since this will fire whenever this screen appears somehow. So either when it launches the first time or when we get back from another screen. So here I want to say selected book view model on select book and pass it null. Because whenever we are on the screen, we want to reset the selected book since no book is selected at that point anymore. And if we now relaunch this, then we should be able to really get the full book information here on our detail screen, which you can then immediately work with. No, it actually crashed. Let's take a look what that is. The very bottom here. There we go. There's our crash. Here. No definition found exception. Oh, okay. Maybe you can already guess what this is. So it says coin. was not able to find a definition for the type selected book view model. And we should check our modules configuration and add missing type or qualifier. So what Coin complains about here is, you actually want me to inject a view model that I don't know how to create. So what we need to do is, we need to go to our modules and actually have a reference to this view model here with this view model off. So for each and every view model, we need to say, we do have a selected view model, a selected book view model now as well. And the moment we register this here, Coin will know how to create this. In this case, it's super simple since it does not require any arguments. Still, we need to do that. So relaunching this. There we go. Our books are loading. And if we now click on a book, then we get the full book information here on our detail screen. So this is now what we can work with on the detail screen as well. If we select a different book, for example, this one, then we also get the different book information, as you can see. So now with this information, we can work with on the detail screen to simply display those book list details or the selected book details in a bit more visual way. So let's get into that book detail screen right now. Where do we put this? Obviously, as part of the book feature, it's a screen, so I want to put it in presentation. And since it's a new screen, we don't want to put it in the existing book list package screen, but we want to create a new one for that. So new package, book_detail. This one might also have a package for components, so for all reusable components that are just used for the book detail screen. And in this screen, we want to create, let's start off with our state. So book detail state. Same structure again, just like for the book list screen, just that this time we talk about the state that we need for the book detail screen. So any values that can change and have an impact on the UI. On the one hand, we have an isLoading value. Oops, not a book, which is false initially. Oh no, actually true. Because even though we have most of the book information immediately available on the book detail screen, there's still a missing piece we have to fetch, and that is the book description. So that comes from from a separate API endpoint, and for that we can display a loading indicator. We can then have a val is favorite. That can change, which we will then use whether we want to make the heart icon filled with red or not. And lastly, we also do need the book that was selected in here, which is null initially. So you might now wonder, okay, don't we already have that in the selected book view model? Yes, but the logic to actually display that book and to do something with that just for the book detail screen will be in the book detail view model. So we need to kind of observe the selected book here in our screen, and then whenever that changes, also forward it to our book detail view model. So the selected book is kind of synced between these two. Next up, let's go to book detail and create a book detail action. So our sealed interface that again couples what a user can do on that screen. On the one hand, that will be a data object on back click, book detail screen, book detail action, I mean. Let me actually launch the other app so you can see what we're actually building here. There we go, it's loading. If we now click on a book, oh, you can see I still have the red box here when I debug this padding issue. Never mind. Let's click on a book. You can see here is a back button that we should actually make in white or so. We will do this for this project. But when clicking this, we obviously get back. And here we have this heart icon. When we click this, we mark the book as favorite or not. So this is another thing we can do by saying data object on favorite click book detail action. And lastly, a data class on selected book change. We pass in the book. This can be non-null here, since on the book detail screen we certainly know that we have a book selected. Book detail action this, and there we go. That's already everything we can do on the screen. And I would say, first of all, we get started with creating the reusable components. So specifically, that will be those chips that we have here together with these titles. And we will create a layout that will help us to draw this blur background here a little bit better. And we will do this in book detail components. So let's first of all create a book chip. So for one of these blue boxes, make this a file, book chip. We'll take a modifier for sure. It will take a size. So certain chips, as you can see, are larger than others. So the language ones are smaller than these ones. So we want to pass in a chip size, which we can create here with an enum class chip size, where we have small and regular, for example. So by the way, a recommendation I can also give you. Some people might work with a Boolean here rather. So they might have something like is small. as a Boolean, which is true if we're talking about a small chip, and false if we're talking about a regular chip. But whenever you're working with a Boolean condition like this one, where the negated variant of that is not obvious to someone who does not know the code, so where it's not obvious what is small actually stands for, because that is not obvious. Does it mean that the chip is big? Does it mean it's regular? Does it mean it's XXL? We don't know. While for a Boolean like enabled, it's completely obvious that when we negate this, it's disabled, because there are only two different variants of this. When it's not obvious, even if you just have two options in your case, work with an enum class instead. This makes things much more readable, and you can extend this much more easily. So I want to work with the chip size enum class here instead. And by default, it's chip size regular. And lastly, we want the chip content here. So what is actually drawn in the chip, the text here, to be a composable lambda, like this. And this is in the end quite simple what a chip is. We can make this just a box. We say the modifier is our modifier here. We say within again, where the minimum width of this chip is dependent on our size, our chip size. Oh, I actually kept it on is small, so this would be the size, of course. So depending on what our size is, we can add the remaining branches here. If it's small, then it should be 50 dp wide at minimum. If it's regular, it will be 80 dp. We can then say we want to clip this. So we have rounded corners to a rounded corner shape of 16 dp. We then give this a background of our light blue, and we add some padding, specifically vertical padding of 8 dp and a horizontal padding of 12 dp. And then we get the look that we have here, depending on our chip size. Furthermore, want to center everything in this box here. Center. And then in here, we really just have the chip content lambda that we can call and add to our box. That way we are really flexible what we want to show here. Since for the rating, we actually have a row with a text and an actual icon. For the other chips, we don't have that, where we just have a text. Let's now next come up with an actual composable that helps us to show these chips with an actual title. This is what I would call titled content, also here. Titled content, make this a file, composable, titled content, which will obviously take the actual title I want to show. It'll take a modifier and again, a content lambda. In here, this will just be a column. So makes sense, I think, that the title and the chip are now arranged in a column-wise fashion. The modifier will be equal to modifier. We want to set the horizontal alignment to alignment center horizontally. And then in this column, we have the text that says the title. Can give it a text style from our theme, material theme, typography, title small. And after that, we simply draw our content. It's a super simple composable, but since we have multiple of these chips here, it makes sense to create a reusable composable for that. Okay, the next composable we'll create will be a bit more complex because it will be for this blurred image background. So this will be a layout where we can then pass the rest. Let's start off with that again in our components package, since it's just needed for the book detail screen. And we have our blurred image background. We make this a file, composable, blurred image background. So what does this blurred image background need? It definitely needs to know the image URL, which it should load the image from. This can be null. It needs to know whether we mark the book as a favorite or not, since the book cover will also be part of this background. We get a lambda when we click on favorite click. And we also draw the back button there, so on back click. And in here we will do something very similar to what we did before, that we work with these image load results, since we need to load this image now with Coil again. But since Coil already cached this image on the book list screen, this will be loaded instantly from our cache. But we still need to, of course, instruct it how it should be loaded and what should happen if it failed to load. So var image load result by, remember again, oops, not remember on backclick, where we say mutable state of, which will hold a result, a Kotlin result this time again, of a painter from compose UI graphics, which is nullable and null by default. And then we can hit Alt Enter twice to import this. And the actual painter reference will then be remember async image painter, where the model is our image URL. And on success is a lambda we need here, where we simply update our image load result with whether the image has valid dimensions. So it result result, what was it called? Actually it.painter it was. Intrinsic size. Let's save this in a variable. So val size. So if the size that width is larger than 1 and the size that height is larger than 1 pixel, then we say that was a successful result with the painter. Otherwise, that was not a successful result. So result failure, and we say the exception is invalid image dimensions. So let's first of all think through how this should work with this blurred image background. So in the end, we will have a big box that just surrounds our whole screen. In this box, we will have a column that consists on the one hand of this blurred image section, as well as this white content section of the screen. The blurred image background is in the end just another image we load with coil. So we just load this image from our cache twice, with the difference that here we will just blur this. Then we will have an invisible spacer for exactly half the height of our blurred image background. So we then draw our image card, our actual image here. And then everything that comes afterwards will just be dynamic content that we pass, that we actually need to pass here to our blurred image background. So we need a composable lambda so that we can add our screen content here. So let's first of all start by defining our box. This really doesn't need any modifiers. We will figure out the rest here inside the box. So let's start off with the big column. This column will fill our whole screen's size, fill max size. So this will now be the column that consists of this blurred image background and this white section. Then for this blurred image background, we will make use of a box again, which will get a modifier with weight 0.3f. So it will take up 30% of our height. We say fill max width to just fill the whole width of our screen, and we give it a background of dark blue. This will only become visible if there is no image to load for the blurred background. I actually not fully remember what happens when we click on a book like this. Yes, then you can see here the blue background will actually show, because blurring this error image would look quite ugly. So that's something I want to do. Inside this box, we can now draw our image. So we have an image composable, give it our painter. So the image load result, or rather we need to have a null check here, whether the image load result dot get or null, which will return the painter if it was a successful result. If that exists, we can draw the image. So the painter one here. Then the content description can be our book title. Do we have the book in here? No. Then let's just say we have a string resource, res dot string dot book cover. Let's call it like that. We can then go to string resources, compose resources, values, strings XML. And maybe we can just add a bunch of resources here that we need on the screen anyways, so we don't have to rebuild this all the time. So let's just duplicate this a few times here. On the one hand, we have this book cover string, book cover for the content description. We then have our rating string. We have our pages one, languages, we do have synopsis, we do have a description not available, and we say description not available. And I think this should be it for now. I'm pretty sure we will need more string resources in this course. Maybe not, maybe we do, but now we already have a foundation for the screen. Let's rebuild this, get back here, then we should be able to import this book cover. Yeah, now it was actually quick. Alt-Enter to import this. We want to pass the content scale crop. So this will simply make the image fill the whole width of our image here, and then cropping the top and bottom edges so that it perfectly fits. And lastly, very important, the modifier. Since we want to fill the max size of our parent box, we then want to blur it with a blur modifier, give it a radius of 20 dp. So the more you choose here, the more the blur will be applied. And that's already enough to draw this blur image. Pretty simple, I think. Below this box, which is now in our outer column, so where we have this blur image, we now want to draw this white section, so the actual content section, which spans 70% of our screen. So here, we will simply draw this. It's really just a container composable here with a box, modifier, give it a weight of 0.7f this time, make it also fill the max width of our screen, and give it our background of desert white. And I think we can already try this out. I think from now on we can get rid of the preview here and rather just launch the app since we already have valid data available. So I will remove this one here and rather go to our screen, which we don't yet have, I think. Let's go to book detail and create our book detail screen. Composable, again, same pattern as for the list screen. Book detail screen root, which does take an instance of our view model, which is our book detail view model. You can also quickly create an empty one for that here in book detail. Book detail view model will be a view model. We will have our state in here. Our book detail state it is. We have a public state underscore state as state flow. And we do have an onAction function that takes in our book detail actions this time. So just an empty view model. Let's also immediately register this here in coin so we don't forget about that. Duplicate this, make this a book detail view model, double colon, and we're safe. So now in our book list screen again, book detail screen, we can observe our state from this view model, collect as state with lifecycle. Alt enter to import that. And then we can come up with our private function book detail screen. Contains the actual screen contents where we pass in the state, where we pass in an onAction lambda with book detail actions. And we mark this as a composable, of course. We can then add the screen here. We don't need a modifier for this one, but we do need a lambda for on back click, since in that case we need to pop the screen from the back stack. And in here, we can then say book detail screen, pass in our state, onAction lambda, where we do get our actions. We want to check if that action was to go back. So if that is a book detail action, on back click, which in that case, we want to just trigger our on back click function. Otherwise, not do anything. So those are really just all the actions that we need to act on in the UI outside of the view model. So everything else we can then submit to the view model so we can handle and update the state there. So now in this book detail screen, we should be able to create our blurred image background. So we can just preview that a little bit in our real app. The image URL will be state book image URL. Make the null check here. Then is favorite will be state book is, what is it? No, state is favorite. It's not part of the book. On favorite click. Here we will trigger on action, book detail action, on favorite click. Then we have on back click, where we trigger on action, book detail action, on back click. We have the modifier, where we just say modifier fill max size. And lastly, we have our content, which will be displayed for this in this white box here. So everything starting from Kotlin programming. We didn't make use of this lambda yet anyway, so we can leave this empty for now. So the only thing that's left in order to try this out is taking this book detail screen root and adding it to our nav host. In application, book detail, and here we can replace this one with, with the book detail screen root, where the view model is now a view model we can create here, just with coin view model, since this is now bound to the screen again, called book detail view model. Pass this in here, and our on back click lambda, when that is called, we can say nav controller navigate up. So we just get to the previous screen. What's important is that whenever the selected book changes in our selected book shared view model, we also need to submit that to our screen bound view model, which we can do with the launch defect block. So whenever this selected book changes, we say view model, or detail view model, on action, book detail action, on selected book change. and we pass in the selected book. Actually, only if it's non-null. So selected book, question mark let, and then we can pass it here instead. So this way we just know the selected book in our screen-bound view model. So we'll also see the book information in here since we pass in the image URL as favorite and so on. So I would say we try this out. Let's launch this and hopefully see a valid blurred image background. We're loading, at least no crashes this time. Click on this one and no, we don't see a blurred image background. Why is that? So apparently loading failed. So this code seems to not execute. What happens if we just use the normal painter here without checking for a successful result? Like this, click here, and no, that also does not work. That is a little bit strange. Can we maybe see something in our logs here? I don't know if we filter for coil, maybe. Let's actually print these logs here. So if there is an error, then we can say it dot result dot throwable print stack trace. So we can see what went wrong here. Going back to our logcat, we click on a book and there we get our exception. Coil null request data exception. The request's data is null. So it seems like the image URL that we pass in here is null. Why is that? I know why that is. Because in our book detail view model, we don't yet accept these actions and update the selected book in here in our book detail state when that changes. Of course, that makes sense. So if the book detail action is actually selected book change, we need to update our state with that. So we need to update our state with it.copy, and our book here is now our book that comes from the action. What else do we have here? If book detail action on favorite click, which we don't implement yet, and otherwise we ignore that since the back clicks are handled on the UI level. This should hopefully fix it. There we go. Loading this, here it is, and yeah, now it works. Now we do see our blurred image background. Let's see how it works like this with our error images. Yeah, that's also how it's intended, because for error images, we don't want to have this blurred background. Very cool. So we can leave this as it is and get to working on our blurred image background, since we're obviously not where we want to be yet. So I've opened the sample app again. The next thing that we want to add is this icon button to go back. And that is also why we have this outer box, so we can easily align things like this icon button in any of the corners of this box. This is very easy. So just below this column, right here in this box, we will have an icon button. When we click this, we say on back click. And the modifier here is modifier dot align. So we're going to align this in our box at the top start. So right here, as you can see, we want to give this a bit of padding. Specifically the top padding 16 dp and the start padding of 16 dp. So it's not exactly in the top corner here, but a little bit padded to the right and bottom. And we also want to add our status bars padding again that will just be the height of our status bar here. So we push this to the bottom. And the actual icon we use for this icon button is an icon with an image vector icons default back. Arrow back, or it's in this auto mirrored thing again. Auto mirrored dot filled back, arrow back. There it is. Content description is, I think I missed this resource. Res string go back. Okay. Let's add this and also add the content description for the favorite button in our string resources. Oh, I closed it on dump. Here. There we go. Duplicate this twice. We have the go back content description as well as mark as favorite or remove from favorites, because that actually differs depending on the state of the icon button. Mark as favorite. Remove from favorites. Make this again. Here we can then import this, hopefully again as quickly as it was before. Yep, there we go. Minimize this, Alt Enter, import that one. And as I said, we want to give this icon, let's say a pure white color, so it's visible on our book background. Like in a real world app, I would probably calculate if this image is rather dark or light, and depending on that, decide about the color of this icon button. But let's keep this at white. keep this at black if you want. There will always be book covers that this will be hard where this will be hard to see on, but I think this will be a bit too much for this course. All right. What comes next and last for this blurred image background is of course the actual book cover together with this icon button for marking it as a favorite. Of course, this book cover now needs to be offset a little bit here in this outer box. And we will achieve this by putting this in a column together with an invisible spacer that gets exactly half the height of this 30% blurred image section. So after this icon button, we'll add a column that will have a horizontal alignment modifier of alignment center. So the book cover is